I was about 12 years old when this happened. My brother and I were hunting in the hills above East Carbon, Utah. We had hiked up a ridge to look for deer. It was getting late, so we decided to head back down the mountain. As we came around a bend on the trail, there was a large black creature standing on two legs looking at us from about 50 yards away. It stood there for several seconds, then turned and ran into some thick brush alongside of the trail. We looked at each other with wide eyes, not knowing what to say or do next, but knew that whatever it was would be long gone by now, so we went over to where it had been standing just moments before and found no tracks because of all the leaves on the ground, but did find some broken branches, which made me think maybe my dad is playing tricks on us since he liked doing things like that. The hair on my neck still stands up when I think about this incident, even though it's been many years ago now. Story 3. I am a 17-year-old, and this incident occurred about a year ago. My mother was out of town for the weekend, so my father decided to take me camping at a place called Wyalusing State Park in Wisconsin. We arrived there on Friday night, set up our camp, and then retired for the night. The following day, we embarked on a hike along the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, which is an absolutely beautiful sight. The hike was quite long and took us most of the day. By the time we finished, it was around dinner time, so we headed back to our campsite. Upon our arrival, we found two men sitting at our picnic table. They explained that they had just moved from another site nearby because ours was more appealing. They asked if they could stay since their belongings were already set up. Being polite, my father agreed. We began cooking some bratwursts over the fire while conversing with these men, whose names I no longer recall. They shared that they grew up near here and used to visit frequently as children, which is why they wanted to go camping again as adults. As the conversation continued, one of them mentioned that he had heard stories about the Manitou from his grandfather, who lived on an Indian reservation in northern Wisconsin. He narrated that his grandfather would tell him tales about how every once in a while someone would disappear without a trace, only for their body to be found days later, completely drained of blood, usually near water sources such as rivers or lakes. He also mentioned that sometimes people claim to see large, hairy creatures walking upright through forests late at night. These sightings have been reported across multiple states, including Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. At first, I thought he was joking, but as he delved into more details, I realized he was as serious as anyone else would be while telling ghost stories around a campfire. The other man seemed to be getting nervous as he listened, so I asked him if he believed in this Manitou thing too. He shared that his grandfather also told him stories about it, but never mentioned anything like what the first man described. Instead, his grandfather claimed that the Manitou was a powerful spirit that could take on many forms, including animals such as wolves or bears, and even humans. According to his grandfather, these spirits would often possess people, causing them to do terrible things before eventually leaving their bodies behind, completely drained of energy. I was unsure of what to make of all this, but my father seemed intrigued, so he asked if they had any more stories. The first man shared a story from his grandfather about how the Manitou could also possess inanimate objects such as trees or rocks and use them to spy on people before attacking them at night when they least expected it. He claimed that once, while camping with his family, his grandfather saw a large rock rolling down a hill towards their campsite. The rock then suddenly stopped right next to where they were sleeping. His grandfather immediately woke everyone up and moved them away from there, just in case whatever was controlling that rock decided to attack. The second man said that he had never heard of anything like that happening, but did mention another story about how some people believe the Manitou is actually an alien creature from another planet who came here thousands of years ago, long before humans even existed. According to these beliefs, these aliens are responsible for creating life on Earth, including humans, by manipulating our DNA. They supposedly still visit us occasionally, either out of curiosity or because they're monitoring our progress. Some people even claim to have seen unidentified flying objects near Indian reservations during times when many sightings have been reported. After hearing all this, I couldn't help but feel somewhat scared, especially since we were alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forests late at night. My father, however, wasn't worried at all. He said those men must have been making everything up just to scare me. He reminded me of how much he loves telling ghost stories around Halloween every year, and laughed off their claims as nothing more than legends passed down through generations. I wanted to believe him, but something inside me kept nagging. The next morning, we packed up and left. I never saw those men again, but the stories they told have stayed with me. My father still thinks it was all just a joke, but I'm not so sure anymore. I've been doing some research on my own, trying to find out more about this Manitou thing. I discovered that it's actually an Algonquian word meaning spirit. It's used by many Native American tribes across North America, including the Ojibwe, Cree, and Menominee. Some people even claim to have seen these spirits themselves during various rituals or ceremonies. There are also many different interpretations of what exactly the Manitou is, depending on who you ask. Some believe it's a benevolent spirit that protects nature, while others think it's an evil entity responsible for causing diseases or other misfortunes. After reading through countless forums and websites dedicated to paranormal phenomena, such as creatures whose existence hasn't been proven yet, or unidentified flying objects, I came across several reports from people claiming to have encountered something similar to what those men described. One person said he saw a large, hairy creature walking upright through his backyard late at night before disappearing into thin air. Another claimed to see strange lights in the sky near where he lives every time there were reports of unidentified flying object sightings nearby. It seems like nobody really knows for sure what these things are or why they're here. But one thing is certain. If you ever come across anything unusual, don't hesitate to report your experience because someone else might be going through the same thing right now too. And remember, always trust your instincts, no matter how crazy they may seem at first, because sometimes the truth can be stranger than fiction. Story 4. I was out on a late-season deer hunt in the Olympic National Forest. After hiking for about 2 hours, I decided to take a break. It was just after dawn, and the cold hadn't fully set in yet. I found a spot at the base of an old cedar tree and began to eat my lunch. Feeling tired from the strenuous hike up into the mountains, I leaned back against the tree trunk and closed my eyes for a few minutes. Suddenly, a loud scream pierced the silence. It was unlike any sound I had ever heard before or have heard since. It seemed incredibly close, perhaps within 100 yards of where I was sitting. My heart skipped several beats as fear washed over me. The sound came again, this time even closer than before. I knew there were no other hunters around because I would have heard the crunch of their boots on twigs and leaves. Then, the smell hit me. A horrible stench filled my nostrils, so foul that it made me want to vomit. The odor was reminiscent of rotting meat mixed with the spray of a skunk. I slowly opened my eyes and scanned my surroundings, hoping to spot a bear or a cougar. But I saw nothing. The screaming continued for several more minutes as the creature moved further away from me. Finally, the screaming stopped, but the smell lingered. It took about 15 minutes before I could muster the courage to stand up and walk again. Such was the fear that had gripped me. It wasn't until later that I learned about the Bigfoot sightings in this area over the years. To this day, the memory of that experience sends chills down my spine. Story 5. I am a 16-year-old male, and for the past few months, I have been experiencing a peculiar sensation. I feel as though there is an entity in my room observing me during the night. This sensation began one night when I woke up to use the bathroom around 2 a.m. Upon returning to my room, I felt as though someone was standing directly behind me as I opened the door. This frightened me to such an extent that I leapt onto my bed from a distance of about 3 feet from the door. Since that incident, every time I go to sleep at night or wake up in the middle of the night, which happens frequently, I am overcome with an intense feeling of fear and paranoia. This feeling is so strong that it almost paralyzes me, making it nearly impossible to move or open my eyes. I fear that if I do, whatever is there might harm or even kill me. The only way I can soothe myself enough to fall back asleep is by covering myself with blankets and pillows, leaving only a small hole for air. This is a habit that has comforted me since my childhood. As long as no part of my body is exposed outside of my covers, I feel safe. Additionally, it feels as though there is some sort of presence sitting on my chest as I lay down trying to fall asleep or wake up during the middle of the night. This sensation sometimes makes it difficult for me to breathe, which can lead to panic attacks. However, this entity does not seem malevolent. It feels more neutral than anything else. It has not done anything harmful yet, but its presence is still terrifying nonetheless. What are your thoughts on this matter? Story 6. I reside in a secluded area surrounded by woods and fields. The environment is usually tranquil, but occasionally, one might hear something peculiar. A few years ago, a friend was visiting and we were spending time on my back porch. Suddenly, we heard a loud scream echoing from a distance. The sound was indistinguishable. It could have been a person or an animal, but it was unlike any sound we had ever heard before. We spent some time trying to decipher what it could have been, but eventually, we gave up and retreated indoors. Fast forward to the previous year. My father was recounting an incident where he saw an unusual creature sprinting across our field one night while he was outside for a smoke. He has since given up smoking. He described the creature as humanoid, but it moved incredibly fast on all fours. When I inquired if he had a clear view of its face, he responded negatively. He said it did not have a face, just eyes and teeth where its head should have been. I am unsure if these two incidents are interconnected, but in my opinion, they are both quite unsettling. Story 7. I was 14 years old at the time, and I lived in rural Washington state. My parents were going out of town for a few days, so they left me with my older brother to watch over me while they were gone. We had just moved into this house about 2 months prior to this incident happening. The first night that my parents were gone, everything seemed normal until it was time for bed. It was around midnight when we decided to go upstairs and get ready for bed. When we got up there, we heard footsteps coming from the attic above us, which is where our bedrooms are located. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal or something, but then realized that whatever it was sounded like a person walking back and forth across the floorboards. My brother grabbed his baseball bat and went outside to see if he could find anything, but didn't see anyone or anything unusual outside. He came back inside after about 5 minutes of searching around outside because he couldn't find anything suspicious. We both went back upstairs together this time, since neither one of us wanted to be alone after hearing those strange noises earlier on in the evening. As soon as we got upstairs again, though, those same exact sounds started up once more. This time, however, instead of just being footsteps pacing across the ceiling boards overhead like before, now there were also other odd noises accompanying them, such as what sounded like someone dragging their feet along behind them too. This continued throughout most of that night, until finally, sometime between 3 o'clock or so, things quieted down enough, allowing us some restful sleep, despite feeling very unnerved by all these weird happenings taking place within our home, while our parents weren't here with us anymore. After waking up later on during daylight hours following that long, restless night beforehand, my brother told me how he'd been awake pretty much all night long, keeping an eye out downstairs, just in case whatever might be causing all these strange disturbances, decided to come down and pay us a visit. He said that he didn't see or hear anything else after the last time we heard those noises upstairs together before going to bed earlier on in the evening. He also mentioned how he was glad nothing happened while our parents were away because, if it had, then they probably wouldn't believe us about what took place here during their absence from home. Story 8. It was the summer of 1999 when I moved to California from Texas. I didn't know anyone yet, so I spent a lot of time exploring my new surroundings alone. One day, while driving around in the mountains near San Diego, I discovered an area that seemed perfect for hiking. I decided to return later with some friends. A few days later, I came back with 2 friends who were visiting from out of state. We parked at the end of a dirt road where there was room for about 3 cars. There were no other vehicles present. As far as we could see, there was nothing but wilderness. No houses or people anywhere nearby. We hiked up into the hills along what appeared to be an old logging trail. The trail led us through a dense forest on one side and steep cliffs on the other, which dropped off into deep canyons below. After walking for about half an hour, we stumbled upon something very peculiar. Several large boulders had been arranged in such a way that they formed a kind of shelter, or enclosure. The boulders were each too large for any human being to move alone. It would have taken many men working together to arrange them this way. The enclosure consisted of 4 upright stones, placed vertically in parallel rows facing each other. These served as supports for 5 horizontal slabs which rested atop them, forming walls and a roof over our heads. The 5th slab also blocked access between 2 sides. The structure measured approximately 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 7 feet high at its tallest point inside. It sloped downward toward the rear, and there was enough space within it to comfortably accommodate all 3 of us standing up straight without stooping. Our first thought upon seeing this structure was that someone must have built it recently, because everything still looked fresh. The rocks hadn't weathered much since being put in place. However, there wasn't any sign of human activity anywhere else around. There was no trash, no footprints, nothing. We decided to investigate further by climbing inside. The ground was covered with pine needles and leaves, which made it difficult to see if there were any tracks or other signs of use. However, we did notice that some branches had been broken off nearby trees, as though someone had used them for bedding material. We also found a small pile of rocks in one corner, possibly remnants from the construction process. There wasn't much else to discover, so we continued on our way up the trail. As we walked along, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from above. We kept looking up into the trees, expecting to see someone hiding among the branches, but we never saw anything. After another half hour or so, we came across a second structure similar to the first, except smaller in size. This time, we noticed several pieces of bark scattered around the entrance, suggesting it might have been used as a roof covering at some point. The whole experience left me feeling very uneasy, so we turned back and headed home Without exploring any further, it's worth noting that this area is part of the Cleveland National Forest, where camping is allowed only in designated campgrounds. There are no private properties anywhere near these trails. I've since returned to the spot many times, hoping to find the structures again, but I haven't seen them despite extensive searching through the surrounding woods. What could explain the presence of these things in such a remote location? Story 9. I was driving home from work on a back road that stretches approximately 5 miles. I reside in the countryside, an area predominantly covered in woods with occasional fields scattered here and there. It was dark outside, but not too late, likely around 9:30 in the evening. I had just made a turn onto this road when my headlights illuminated something crossing the road ahead. My initial thought was deer, because our area is teeming with them. However, as I approached closer, I realized that whatever it was, it certainly wasn't a deer. The creature moved in a manner similar to a human, on 2 legs. Unlike most animals that scamper off into the woods at the sight of an approaching car, this creature continued its slow pace across the road until it finally vanished into the darkness. The creature stood at an estimated height of 7 feet, or possibly more, and it had very broad shoulders. The hair covering its body was a blackish-brown color and appeared to be quite dense all over, except for its face, which seemed bare, devoid of any hair. Its eyes were glowing red in my headlights, reflecting the light back at me. The sight of this creature frightened me immensely. After witnessing what I did that night, I am utterly convinced that Bigfoot indeed exists. A few weeks later, while hunting with my brother-in-law near his house, which is only about 5 miles away from where I had seen this creature cross the road, we heard an eerie howling sound. It was unlike anything either of us had ever heard before or since then. Story 10. I was driving home from work one night when I saw what I thought was a deer in the road. It was dark, so I slowed down to avoid hitting it. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a deer at all, but rather some kind of creature that bore an uncanny resemblance to an animal with human features. It had long hair covering its body, and it stood on 2 legs, just like a human. The creature seemed startled by my car's headlights, so we both stopped for a moment before continuing on our separate ways. The next day, I went back to the spot to see if there were any marks or evidence left behind by this strange creature. All I found was the grass flattened where it had stood. A few weeks later, while walking through the woods near my house, I heard something rustling in the bushes nearby. When I turned to see what it could be, another one of these creatures jumped out at me. This time, they were more aggressive than before and started growling loudly right in front of me. They also had sharp teeth, which made them appear even more intimidating than before. However, they didn't seem to be afraid of humans, as they kept coming back again and again over several months. Eventually, someone else reported seeing them too. After that incident, everyone in the area became aware of their existence. Now, whenever anyone sees them, they report it immediately to the local authorities, who then go out looking for them at every opportunity. This is going to be a long story, but it's time I share it. I've had several encounters with a cryptid known as Dogman. These are not your average canines. Instead, they are humanoid animals that walk upright just like humans do. One evening, after getting off work late at night, I decided to take an alternate route home since traffic would have been bad due to construction on other roads leading into town. The Dogman is described as having shaggy fur covering most parts of its body, with the exception of its face. It has pointed ears similar to those found on German shepherds and glowing eyes that resemble those of wolves. It stands on 4 legs, similar to a hyena, and has a canine head and snout that resemble those of German shepherds, Dobermans, wolves, hyenas, and jackals. Its strong arms and hands are reminiscent of those seen on gorillas and orangutans, and its powerful hindquarters resemble those of kangaroos and gorillas. It has a short tail, similar to those seen on lions and dogs, and wolf-like feet and claws that resemble those seen only among extinct species such as dire wolves. Story 11. I had several bizarre experiences reminiscent of the X-Files while hiking in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I'm not sure what happened to me, but it was, and still is, extremely strange and unexplainable. It all started in the summer of 2017, when my wife and I decided to take a trip up north from Los Angeles for a few days. We wanted to get away from the city life for a while, so we headed towards Yosemite National Park. We had never been there before, so we thought it would be fun to explore some new territory. We arrived at our hotel around 9 p.m. on a Friday night. I can't remember the exact date. The place was called the Ahwahnee Hotel. It's an old, historic building that has been renovated into a luxury resort with modern amenities. There are several buildings spread out over acres of land surrounded by pine trees and mountains. After checking in, we went straight to bed because we were exhausted after driving all day long. The next morning, Saturday, my wife woke me up early, around 7:30 a.m. or 8 a.m., I don't know the exact time, because she said she heard something outside our room. She told me that she heard footsteps walking back and forth along the side of our building near her window. She also said that she could hear heavy breathing coming from outside, as well as grunting noises like someone was trying hard to catch their breath while they walked or ran back and forth along the wall of our room. At first, I didn't believe her story because I thought maybe she just imagined it, since this was such a remote location where no one else should have been staying at this hour except us. But then, I got curious about what might be going on outside, so I got out of bed to look out the window myself. When I looked out my window facing west towards the main road leading into Yosemite Valley, there wasn't anything unusual going on, except for 2 deer grazing right below us beside a tree line across from another building, similar to ours, only further down closer to where those footsteps were coming from earlier. So now you're probably wondering, why did these events become bizarre? Well, here comes part 2. About 20 minutes later, after hearing those footsteps again, moving back and forth along the side of our building, suddenly everything became very quiet. Too quiet. My wife asked if anyone was out there anymore. So naturally, being concerned about safety issues, especially being in such an isolated area far away from civilization, we both grabbed flashlights and opened up our door cautiously, looking left, then right, seeing nothing suspicious whatsoever anywhere nearby, nor any other people besides ourselves anywhere within sight or sound range throughout this entire property, including inside each individual room itself. It seemed odd how quiet everything became after hearing those footsteps running back and forth repeatedly along the side of our building just moments ago. Then suddenly, without warning, something extremely peculiar occurred. A loud screeching noise came screaming through the air above us, sounding like some kind of wild animal mixed with high-pitched human screams combined together, creating an ear-piercing shrill sound unlike anything either one of us had ever heard before. My wife screamed loudly, asking, "What is that?" I honestly couldn't answer her question, because neither one of us knew what made that horrible shrieking noise until much later when things began making sense. The more research I did online regarding paranormal activity throughout history, specifically unidentified flying object sightings and cryptid encounters, eventually led me directly onto your website, Mr. Phantom Skeptic himself. And boy, oh boy, do I wish I found your site sooner than I actually did. I truly believe, based upon all evidence gathered thus far, that the Mothmen may have possibly played some role during these bizarre experiences while hiking in Yosemite National Park last year during late August 2017, especially considering how many others have reported similar experiences throughout history dating way back decades ago, even centuries ago, describing nearly identical circumstances involving unexplained disappearances, deaths, mysterious creatures, etc., all happening within close proximity surrounding areas known as portals or vortexes connecting dimensions together, allowing interdimensional beings access between worlds, including Earth. Well, anyway, that's pretty much it, folks. That's every detail worth mentioning concerning my personal account detailing the weirdness occurring within Yosemite National Park last year during late August 2017. Story 12. I have been a truck driver for approximately 10 years now. Throughout this time, I have encountered some peculiar sights, but one incident remains vivid in my memory. The event occurred around 2 o'clock in the morning. It was raining heavily that night, which significantly reduced visibility. However, what transpired next will forever be etched in my memory. As I was driving down a deserted stretch of highway near my hometown, a creature darted across the road right in front of my truck at an alarming speed. Initially, I assumed it was a deer, or perhaps a bear, as they are common in our region. However, as soon as the creature crossed into the beam of my headlights, my perception changed dramatically. The creature resembled a hybrid of a man and a wolf. It had elongated arms and legs, akin to those depicted in werewolf movies. Its fur was a dark grayish-brown, and its eyes glowed a bright, eerie red. The most terrifying aspect was that this creature stood and ran on 2 legs, much like a human would if they were in a hurry to cross the street. I immediately applied the brakes upon seeing this creature sprint across the road in front of me. However, by the time I had come to a stop, it had already vanished into the adjacent woods. Once I had regained my composure, I dialed the emergency services to report what I had witnessed. Simultaneously, I called my wife, who works nearby and was working late that night, to come and pick me up. Story 13. In the late fall or early winter of 1989, my brother-in-law and I were hunting deer on the backside of a mountain range. We were traversing a ridgeline when we stumbled upon an area that had been logged off several years prior. The ground was covered in a thick green undergrowth about knee-high, resulting from the logging debris. As I ventured into this area, I noticed what appeared to be 2 footprints ascending the hill through the thicket, leading towards another tree line. My initial thought was that they were bear tracks, but upon closer inspection, I noticed 5 distinct toes in each print. They were strikingly similar to human footprints, except for their size. Each print was approximately 15 inches long and 6 inches wide across the ball of the foot, significantly larger than any human footprint I had ever seen. The prints seemed fresh, as you could see the impressions they had made on the leaves. I called my brother-in-law over to examine them, and he concurred that they did not resemble bear tracks. He jokingly commented, "They are too big for me," referring to his own shoe size. We decided to follow these mysterious tracks until we reached another cluster of trees further up the hillside. Here, we discovered more sets of the same tracks leading away from us towards a creek bed. However, as darkness began to fall, we decided to return home and investigate further at a later time. Unfortunately, during our absence, a heavy rain washed away all evidence of the tracks. To the best of my knowledge, no one else has ever reported seeing these tracks. This intriguing incident occurred near Marmot, West Virginia.